whilst they bring up the slides, maybe we'll just do some intros in terms of who we are. So I'm Neil. As Matthias said, we're both from Atomico, which is a venture capital fund here in Europe. For those of you who don't know, it's early stage tech fund, focused Series A to C. Check size is 5 to 25 million, founded by a guy called Nicholas Zenström, who founded Skype. And we're interested in European predominantly disruptive tech businesses, as I'm sure all of you guys are as well. So that's what we do, or that's what I do. I'm a partner in the fund. The other half of my time, I also spend as an advisor, mentor, and chairman of a few marketplace businesses in particular. To give you a couple of examples, one is called Glovo, which is an on-demand, anything in your city app based out of Spain and scaled into 20 countries right now, so I'm chairman of that. Another one would be a company called Truvo, which is a marketplace for homewares a la Farfetch, so independent boutiques being matched with unique goods to demand side. So I love marketplaces. Before that, I've been lucky enough to be involved in a bunch of different marketplaces, been an operator for 15 plus years. Two, I think, are most relevant for today's chat. One was called Betfair, which is now an $8 billion listed UK company. I was chief operating officer there. And what we did there was basically disintermediate the bookmakers and match people together. So the demand and supply came from people rather than traditional bookies. And then after that, the other most relevant experience, which we're going to talk about today, was at Uber, and my job was as SVP of International, I think looking after about 50 odd countries outside of the US. So that's what we're going to try and pick up today. I'll let Jambu introduce himself first as well.
Thanks, Neil. I'm Jambu. I, like Neil, spent quite a bit of time at Uber. I was one of the first 100 employees there and initially joined in San Francisco. Basically did two jobs. One was I led the international strategy and expansion team, so taking Uber to new markets, and then ran a couple of businesses. Ran Uber's business in emerging markets, Eastern Europe, Russia, the Middle East, and Africa on the ride-sharing side, and then for about 2 years ran the Uber Eats business as that came up and as we decided to go deeper into that. What we wanted to do today was tell you a little bit about some of the context as to how Uber scaled, some of the challenges we faced. Hopefully it's relevant to a lot of the businesses that you work on, but also use some examples from some of the companies we work with more closely that Atomico's invested in, and share some of the perspective we've got there. A lot of it is also really about understanding what's useful to you all, so we'll save some time for questions at the end. This is also the first time we've actually done a bit of a debrief and look back at our time at Uber, which was actually fun for us to put together.
Okay, so I think we're probably preaching to the crowd here a little bit about marketplaces and why they're interesting. We don't need to tell you what they are. But I did this exercise about a year ago, and I looked at them. I thought, look, I kind of like marketplaces. They're kind of pretty valuable and defensible, aren't they? So I checked it out and I asked a guy to help me. And what we did is we looked across 3 regions, the US, Europe, and Asia, and just said, of the top 25 private companies, what are marketplaces out of that 25? And roughly what you see is about a third of the most valuable ones, the private ones, are marketplaces. Now, I've been a little bit liberal with some of this stuff, right, in my interpretation. For example, Amazon is on there. So you wouldn't say it's a pure marketplace, but obviously they enhance their model by having a marketplace on there. But there's some great names on there. I've been lucky enough, as I said, I worked at that Betfair in Europe and obviously at Uber. So we're going to try and draw on some of those experiences to talk about it. What you will see, and we'll show you this later, that across the region, pretty much every single part of the world, both geographically and in terms of its sector, has some very, very interesting marketplace models. As you guys know, they're hard to build, but when you build them, they can become very valuable and very defensible.
I think nobody in this room needs to know how hard these businesses are, right? There's a lot at stake, there are a lot of actors, and there are a lot of companies with great ideas that have had massive challenges in actually achieving their results. There's no guarantees, and some examples of companies that have had good ideas and really resilient, smart entrepreneurs behind them, but haven't been able to overcome those challenges. HomeJoy, which is a cleaning service app in San Francisco, had a really great product experience, but one of the takeaways from their challenges were that In a marketplace where things are extremely uncommoditized from a supply perspective, there's risk of customers, and this is booking cleaners for your house, customers actually taking cleaners off of the platform because they found somebody they liked, and that's a challenge that can really doom a marketplace. Take It Easy, a food delivery app in primarily Western Europe, had a phenomenal product experience. At one point was the market leader in Paris, one of the largest food delivery business markets in the world. And the challenge there was around unit economics and how you could continue to deliver a high level of service with challenging and negative unit economics. And there are a lot of companies that have pushed into the laundry space, and that one is one where the actual economics of delivery versus the average order values have always been tough to reconcile.
So, just to put that in data, I mean, this is not pure marketplaces. This is just the data from an Atomico State of the European Tech. And what you'll see is that, they're valuable and defensible, but there are no guarantees. So what you see here is the survival rate after 4 rounds of funding. And roughly speaking, it's easier than ever to start a business today, but by the time you get to Series D, there's only about 5% of people survive. So yes, awesome models, but let's be realistic about what wins. So how many of you guys have looked at Bill Gurley's stuff about marketplaces? Hands up. Okay, not as many as I thought. For those of you who didn't put up your hands, go read it. There's Bill Gurley, I think it's called Above the Crowd. I should have put the URL up there, but basically what he does is he puts out 10 attributes or a framework to evaluate and scale marketplaces. Actually, from his perspective, he's just looking at it from an investor. So he says these are the 10 things that when he's invested in marketplaces over the years, are the attributes of things that make them the most successful. But what I'd urge you to do is also look at these for how you're building your own marketplaces, because there's some clues in here for things that you should focus on to make sure they work really well. I'm not going to run through each of them, but what we're going to try and do is give you some examples of how this works from an Uber perspective. So what we do, or what I do when I'm looking at new businesses, is I use a framework such as this, and there are a bunch of others out there that people have posted on the web, so you should really read some of this stuff. And I add on unit economics, competitive dynamics, and team, just to pick a couple to give you an idea. Businesses that have high frequency. We've talked about food, the fact that we all order food and turn, 2 or 3 times, or eat food 2 or 3 times every day. When you look at the frequency of food apps, it turns out that users are coming back a lot, and that gives you more chance to give them an amazing experience, to earn money, and all the rest of it. Number 2 there, economic advantages. How do you think about not just number 1, having a brand new experience that's way better than what you're used to? I don't know, let's use an Uber example. The difference in standing in the rain in London last night trying to get a black cab versus, and maybe it stops for me, maybe it doesn't, versus taking out my phone, pressing in a button, the car comes in an average 3 minutes, and I don't have to use a tip or cash or anything like that. That's a very different experience, but the economic advantage is such that it's also cheaper. So there are a few things down here that you should look at that really help evaluate and also scale your business. I'll pick just one more: high fragmentation. It's typically better building a marketplace where you've got a very fragmented supply side and a demand side. Why? Because it's easier to speak to both sides, rather than if you're building a marketplace with, let's say, banks, which have a massive amount of power and very difficult to get to do stuff. So there's 10 things down there. If you add on to that, thinking about your unit economics, the competitive dynamics, obviously the team, I kind of think about that as a framework for both investing and also scaling marketplaces. So just flick on one if you could, Jambu.
One thing I'll add quickly is, in marketplace businesses that have been successful, one of the common themes is actually creating a new market or actually expanding the state of a current market. And I think number 8 there is a really interesting one to think about in the context of the experience we both went through at Uber. If you looked at the size of the global taxi market when Uber started, it was actually comparatively small relative to the value of all of the ride-hailing companies in the world. It was maybe $6 or $7 billion. But actually creating a differentiated customer experience with better economics for suppliers and an easier experience for customers that was delightful and created higher frequency of use actually brought other markets like car rental or bus transport into the TAM of a company like Uber. And so it's a really interesting idea around, are you starting with a high top line, or are you actually creating a product experience that gives you the potential to go beyond that?
So what we're going to try and do is, if you break down these 10, essentially there's 4 major areas here. One is this whole idea of a better and repeatable user experience, both on the demand and on the supply side. The next sort of area is around, well, how do we really grow demand and supply? Then we talk about the size of the market opportunity, this idea of expanding it. So looking after what are large addressable markets both now and the potential they have to grow. And then kind of how do you get those network effects? Where's the tipping point and how do you monetize it? So we'll use those 4 to try and give you some ideas of what we learned at Uber.
This was a really, really interesting early drawing from Uber's life that I think illustrates this concept really well. And the idea is, as you have more of these inputs into a marketplace, it actually creates something we called a virtuous cycle that created a better customer experience and more defensibility. So I'll just walk you through it quickly, right? And so at Uber, one of the things that we focused on doing was adding drivers, so the right side of that chart. So you add more drivers. That allowed you to have more geographical coverage and saturation, which led to faster pickups. But if you had faster pickups, that actually increased demand from consumers because people started using the product more frequently. And if you had more demand, that actually allowed more drivers to come on the platform and earn greater wages. And that circle continued. It started to add less driver downtime, and what that led to was lower prices, which again increased demand. And so that cycle actually led to a business that built upon itself and became very hard for somebody else to come in and actually deliver the same degree of customer experience. And I think the most successful marketplaces have some element of that virtuous cycle. The other thing is the speed at which companies are growing has increased dramatically over the last decade. And if you look at this chart, effectively what it is just showing years since the launch of the company, T+, and the GMV generated in billions of dollars. And you can see companies like Alibaba, Airbnb, and eBay, and Uber, and the relative increase in speed at which they achieved those valuations. And I'm sure if you plot the next generation of companies that have achieved those milestones, it's even faster. The point of this, I think, is that speed matters, and focus on execution, replicable playbooks, and a global structure and ambition from the beginning is just an inherent part of these businesses. The other important input here, which we found interesting when we looked at the numbers, was these companies, on average, basically raised money every 11 months, and each valuation was about 2.5x the previous valuation. And so that's sort of the pace setting of speed, not just for valuations, which are just sort of benchmarks, but actual pace of growth that some of the most successful companies have achieved. I guess the point of this is just saying that these marketplaces can be big, but there's fierce competition for execution, and the capital required can be high as well.
Okay, so we'll come back to some of the lessons learned, and we'll use the Uber example now. So there's the 4 categories that I mentioned before. Let's start with a better, repeatable experience. So the story of Uber, you guys may or may not know this, but actually started in Paris. There's a picture of the 2 co-founders. You might notice the Eiffel Tower behind them. Interesting fact, actually, that at that time, these guys were trying to get a cab back at night. They stopped the first one. He wouldn't take them because they're going the wrong direction. Second one wouldn't take credit card, wanted cash. And so they were having a bit of a problem. And one turns to the other, as the story goes, and says, hey, wouldn't it be great if you could pull an iPhone out of your pocket, press a button, car comes, takes you wherever you want to go. And that's what they went and did. Actually, interesting fact about Paris at the time was when Uber started there were 13,000 taxis in Paris. And in 1950, there were also 13,000 taxis in Paris. And during that time, the population had 3x'd. So guess what happens when you have 3x the demand and the same supply? It's not a good experience. And that's the principle of a great marketplace, is if you can scale the supply to meet the demand, then it generally works. If you're constraining your supply, then it's going to be a bad experience. So, making it a better experience. I think you all know this, so I'll go quickly. You open up the app, you set the pickup location, you confirm the payment, you request the car, the driver comes in 4 minutes in this example, you can see who he is, you can see the vehicle he's driving and his rating in this case. Takes you to where you want to go, you get out, You pay, but you pay virtually with your credit card in this case, and you submit a rating. So fundamentally different experience from the one I just described with those two guys in Paris that late night, where it was not guaranteed. They had to pay with cash. It didn't necessarily want to go in the direction they wanted to go. And of course, this was all in a foreign language to them versus digital.
That principle has been applied across a lot of sectors, right? You'll recognize some of the names of companies here. I think the premise of marketplaces that has excited us at Atomico, and I think personally, has been this idea of using technology, can you actually create differentiated experience? And you look at some of these companies, some of which you may have used, and the premise of aggregation, but also owning the delivery and payment process has clearly gone past single industries. And the simplification has, I think, really shifted consumer behavior, which is an interesting concept, right? Which is, if you look at sort of the digital banking revolution underway right now, and the companies that have just built brilliant product experiences that shifted consumer behavior, marketplaces can be on the leading edge of that evolution. One of the things that I think really helped and mattered at Uber was supply-side product experience. And so the two things that I think were really important for us were flexibility for drivers, so drivers having no set schedule and being able to come on and come off the platform whenever they wanted. But two, if you look at that screenshot on the left, the data science that actually went on behind that. So what this is it's a heat map, and those hexagons are areas of San Francisco where demand is high and are undersupplied. And this was a way to effectively encourage drivers to actually move to those areas if they were offline to go online, and actually balance supply and demand, maximize earnings for drivers, and provide a better customer experience. And what that allowed for was highly predictable earnings and matching of supply and demand in a way that previously hadn't been done. One of the points that's really important is this project, which is actually one of the ones that had the most impact at Uber in its history, was actually conceived as a bit of a side project. We had these things at Uber called workations, which are not as glamorous as they sound, but effectively a group of people would get together sort of in the winter break period and actually go and travel somewhere and work on a project, and their flights and accommodation would be paid for by the company. But the expectation was that they'd work on something that was really relevant to the business that maybe they didn't have time to do in their day-to-day. And that's actually what spawned this, this project. And an interesting point of the outcome is that ultimately in marketplaces, when the stakes are so high and you're the intermediator, if you get some of these things wrong, it can be extremely expensive. And I think that we'll talk about unit economics a bit, but the importance of getting those right can make or break some of these companies.
So the other part of the experience is not just better, but also, how do you think about pricing? And so I just wanted to use a real example here. This is, again, from London. You'll see in blue on the left the price of an UberX. UberX is obviously the more cheaper end, which is now about 90% of all Uber trips because of the point I'm about to make. And here what you see is the rough price of an UberX versus a black cab from two places in London. And roughly speaking, it's about half the price, whether you look at it going to the airport or downtown London. And the point that this was realized was actually, and these are real stats from New York at the time we kind of worked this stuff out, and what you can see here is on the top left, you can see the average UberX fare in 2012, $36. And then to the right as we reduced it. So what you can see is as he reduced it in 2013 and then to $27 in 2014, something interesting happened. Remember that little picture that Jambu drew up before? At the bottom, what you can see is the number of minutes per hour that the driver in blue is making money. They're on the trip, they're making money, versus in light grey, waiting or doing nothing. And what you see is as you reduce the fare, the number of minutes obviously goes up over time. And then the next question usually is, well, okay, fine, but what about the driver? Isn't he getting screwed? And the answer is no, because as you increase the demand, he's doing more trips per hour. Although the fare per trip is lower, the total amount, top right, is going up. So you can see they're going from $24 an hour to $36. And this is the idea of price elasticity driving utilization and earnings. And it's really, really important in your space to work out the price elasticity. So if you can work that out and you can have a better product and at a price that's potentially cheaper as well, then that is a really magic combination.
The interesting input on earnings that we learned from the early days was when we came into a new city, there were actually a lot of people who were effectively middlemen in this industry. Right? They were company owners or dispatch operators or owned marketing agencies that had B2B contracts, but actually were not adding any value to the ecosystem. And so these driver earnings actually were just a fraction of what drivers are actually getting, if that makes sense. So this was a lot more than drivers were earning. They were earning closer to minimum wage. And we were able to actually disintermediate a lot of the middlemen who weren't adding a lot of value and connect consumers directly with drivers. That led to an increase in earnings for drivers and the ability to charge a much lower price. So would encourage you to look at the businesses you're in and really make sure you understand if there are people in the value chain that aren't actually adding value, if that makes sense.
Yeah, to put some real numbers on that, I mean, these are New York numbers. I think the medallion price of a New York, medallion being the license that allows you to operate a taxi cab firm, was about $1 million. It's pretty much zero now today because of that disintermediation. And so you're taking out the margin and distributing it effectively to both sides, your demand and your supply, higher earnings for the supply side and better price for the consumer.
That premise is one that you can apply to a lot of businesses, right? So Neil mentioned his experience in Betfair, and that's exactly what they did. The middle one's a company we've invested in called Jambu Palaniappan, which is doing a very similar thing in making wages really accessible to people and matching employers and employees. And then Lime, a company we've invested in recently, you may have seen the e-bikes floating around Berlin, is doing exactly the same thing. Better experience, but also using a lot of data science to actually make the customer experience cheaper as well.
Okay, so we'll go on to the next topic, supply and demand growth. Here's a sort of schematic to how we thought about growing supply. So I've just picked one city that we rolled out. This is Chengdu in China. And essentially what we'd do is we'd try and make a great experience in a small area first. So we'd pick, say, the central area. We'd create what we call a geofence. It was an area in which the service operates. And frankly, what we'd do is we'd subsidize supply to make sure that when you went out there and pressed a button, a car came and it came in a short period of time. So even though there was not a lot of organic demand to start with, we would go to a bunch of drivers and say, hey, you can earn $20 an hour to sit there and do nothing, because when that button gets pressed the first time, there's like 3 cars or 5 cars or 10 cars all around them ready to pick them up. So that means you have a great experience from the start. Now, that's obviously a more expensive way of doing it, but for us, and it's the thing that leads to virality we found, is like having a fantastic experience by having your supply side first, is something that we worked out made a big difference. And then, obviously, over time, what happens is you grow it. So as you get, and we'll come on to the metrics you can use for this later, but as you have a great experience, you then start to grow it over time. Rather than starting like this and having a few cars dotted all over the place, go for a more concentrated supply-first strategy, make an awesome experience, and then grow it from there.
And this is particularly true for marketplaces that are geographically constrained, right? Some of you may be doing things that are purely digital, but we found in sort of online to offline businesses that this was one of the big mistakes that a lot of our competitors made, is they tried to service too large of an area too quickly, and that kills your burn rate and also leads to a terrible experience for customers.
So this is, that was a sort of theoretical one. This is in 2015, a picture. It looks a bit weird, I know. It looks like some kind of modern day painting, but it's actually a picture of London. And what each of the blue dots represents is the starter and end of an Uber trip. And so what I was trying to do there is link the theory with what the reality. So in the case of London, obviously we started in the middle, and just like I showed you in Chengdu, it expanded out. And so you can start to see how concentrated it is in the center of London, but that over time it spreads to the point of, this is a few years ago now, 2015, it went from a few drivers in like 2013 to 25,000 drivers and 2 million users in about 2 years. So that's how your good experience spreads. And it spreads because of the fact that you've given an awesome experience to start with, especially if you can do it, we'll come on to it later, with some kind of incentive, a referral scheme perhaps to get somebody to use it. You like it, you then go and use it again, and you tell your friends about it. The other part of growing supply, and I referred there to like incentivizing the demand side, which we'll come back to. But one of the things is an example from India where we wanted to not just prime it using money to get supply, but here's an example of an app we actually built in India. It's called Dost, which is a Hindi word for friend, and we built this app to try and incentivize drivers to both educate other drivers, but to also allow them to monetize their referrals based on the number of trips. So you can see here, this person has earned 18,000 rupees, their target's 90,000, and they can see all of the people who are effectively part of their family. And so what we did on both sides of the marketplace, and at some points, I think at a height, we had about 60% of our supply and demand coming from purely only referral schemes. And this is an example of how we did it. So you go to a driver, get him to use it, then say, hey, why don't you tell your friends, why don't you educate your friends about this as well, and we'll incentivize you to grow it. And if you've got a great experience and some tools to do it, it can work phenomenally well.
On the demand side, one of the mistakes we see a lot is early on in a company's life cycle, massive spend on marketing, particularly on AdWords and Facebook. And one of the lines we used at Uber was that at the beginning of Uber, the first 2 years, we didn't spend a single dollar on marketing. It's obviously not true, but it's an interesting premise to think about this conversation. One of the mechanisms we relied on to actually grow the business in the first, I'd say, 2 years of any geography we're in was almost entirely reliant on a referral program. And we would only turn that referral program on when we had a customer experience that we felt good about getting behind, because you don't want to refer someone to a poor customer experience. And then we'd use this idea of people giving Uber credit and receiving Uber credit for their friends taking rides as a massive component of our early stage demand growth. At some points, it would be 60 to 80% of early stage demand growth. It led to virality, and it led to the ability to more efficiently gain new users who retained and stayed, rather than just throwing money at the top of the funnel on paid marketing ads and not really seeing the benefits of that. It was also more proportional, right? Because as you had a smaller user base, you'd actually have fewer dollars committed rather than having to spend a lot at the beginning to generate awareness. The second thing that matters a lot is this didn't matter at all if we didn't have the product experience. If you started spending a lot on referrals, but you didn't have the product experience, it was just a massive sort of waste of money. It led to a lot of fraud. As the business grew, we actually shifted from what you see on the left to what's on the right, which is instead of $20 for a customer in credit, it actually shifted to a free ride. And that may seem subtle, but actually there's a massive difference there, because a free ride was actually much, much cheaper than $20. And so you could actually get much more efficient with how you actually allocated your spend, and also encourage people to sort of put some healthy pressure on their friends to take trips, and created more viral sharing mechanisms as well that were localized. So we used WeChat in China, or Line or Kakao in Asia, for example. You've seen a lot of companies do this and do it really well. This is actually one of the best examples that we've seen. This is from TransferWise. And what you'll see here is in the middle, TransferWise saying, well, you'll earn £50 for every 3 friends who start using TransferWise. But later in the cycle, you see in the flow, so at a different point in the flow, you actually be able to invite friends and earn £50 just for inviting your friends. And that's subtle in its difference, but it can actually lead to dramatically different behavior. And so referral programs can be really powerful if you invest the time from a data and analytics perspective in understanding what behavior you're trying to incentivize and where in your user experience to actually do that. We used to do the referral after somebody had a particularly delightful trip. So if they left a comment saying this was a great driver, that was a signal for us to send them the referral screen immediately after, for example.
Okay, we've been given the 5-minute warning. I think we did start a couple of minutes late, so... All right, great. So I'll try and go a bit faster then. So another part of the demand side was building buzz. So here's an example of the playbook we'd use for entering a city. I talked about the supply side. Now, what we'd do is we'd throw out early secret Ubers arrive in Chengdu. Why secret? Because we want it to be aspirational. This go out on social media, people are going, oh, what's this weird thing? Then the second thing we'd do is we'd find somebody who was aspirational in that city. In this case, is a gold medalist, Olympic gymnast, and we'd get him to be what we called Rider Zero. We'd go to him and say, hey, do you want to be the first cool guy in the city to use this new thing? He usually says yes, because he wants to build his social following, but he also pushes it out on whatever the equivalent of, Instagram or whatever. And that helped build buzz. Here's another example that I did at Betfair, where we were trying to disintermediate the bookmaker. He's the dead guy in the coffin in the middle. We got the two founders to walk this down Fleet Street, which is the major newspaper area in London, and basically pronounce that the bookmaker is dead. Free PR, it costs us nothing to do, but in all of these examples, they're basically free, and they create an enormous amount of PR. One other example that I really love, and my team in Malaysia did this, and experimentation is kind of the point. What happened here, and you can look this up on YouTube, actually the slide's cut off, and I'll tell you why that's important in a minute. What happened here was this lady ordered an Uber X, and we were secretly videoing, and we have a McLaren supercar show up instead. So she's expecting a Toyota Prius or something to show up, and this thing shows up. And so we video 8 people with this happening. And you can't see it at the bottom, but it was kind of fun, and it turns out that 9 million other people watched this video. And that created buzz about Uber, it created virality, and the best thing of all was McLaren paid us to do this. Why? Because they wanted the association with their brand with something else cool. So again, completely free, 9 million people looked at it, and these are some of the techniques you can use.
The nature of early stage businesses is you're going to have to invest to grow. And the point of this slide is actually just a really simple one. I see a lot of companies with positive numbers on the left chart, growing GMV and net revenue. Well, one of the things that's really important is understanding unit economics. And if you look at the chart on the right, effectively, there's going to be a period where you're going to have to invest. That T is sort of the break-even line. And the speed at which you can overcome that challenge, prove positive unit economics, have a massive impact on your ability to raise money in the future, but also build and run a sustainable business. If you go back to those examples of some of the companies that weren't successful, this was a problem that they ultimately ran into. And if your contribution curve looks more like the dash line, where as you get bigger, your contribution burn increases versus finds a path to turn upward, that's a place that you want to try to get out of. To be clear, it doesn't have to be perfect, but the proof points about being able to get to that point matter a lot. Some examples that we've sort of used as a framework to do that are: one, pick a number of places to prove the market. Don't try to expand too fast, too quickly. Work out and understand what you're going to do centrally versus locally if you're a business that's got local operations. Localization required from a product perspective is an important one. That's a lesson we learned at Uber, and the importance of understanding that different countries and even different cities are going to behave differently. And then maybe most importantly, once you've worked it out, you've got to go fast. Rinse and repeat, build your playbooks, and execute. We spent a lot, I get asked this a lot, we spent a lot of time at Uber trying to build the most perfect quantitative model for expansion. What are the cities we should go to? In what order? How should we evaluate where to go? And if I'm honest with you, this model that went on for 5-6 years, the answer we really got to at the end was actually that if you could build a great product experience and customer experience, and the model's repeatable, your target market can be everywhere. And so ultimately where we got to was we wanted to be everywhere. Every city that had more than 1 million people was a market that Uber wanted to be in, and there were different priorities and different investment requirements. But the importance of understanding how repeatable our model was key in actually achieving the ambition that we wanted to. Large addressable markets help. The lines in red are the growth of Uber cities in China versus the rest of the cities. And one of the anecdotes that we talked about this morning is actually, despite the incredible sort of hockey stick curves, we were actually late in this exercise, and Didi was already there and really successful.
So the next section very quickly is about expanding the market. We talked about having an awesome experience in expanding the taxi market. Here's an example from Airbnb, where you see on the left, kind of before them, you've got the 26% of the hotels are located outside of the central zip code in San Francisco, and then after them, they got 72% of their properties outside of those. In other words, they're expanding the market from traditional hotels into something bigger. The equivalent at Uber here was, of course, we started with Uber Black, very expensive, luxurious. We learned the price elasticity thing that I explained earlier to get to Uber X. We went one step further with Uber Pool, again, cheaper still. And then, of course, the biggest cost is people. And so taking the driver out of the car and ultimately having autonomous vehicles is the next iteration. So if you can think about how you can expand your market and also make your unit economics better, then it's powerful. So the next iteration on that, I think we'll probably, well, let me just use this one slide. I think, you can obviously go beyond that, and I wanted to show this one because I kind of thought it was funny. Flying cars, anyone? I mean, these things do actually exist, but this was the very first attempt to do it, where some genius decided to literally join a car with a plane together, and actually didn't work out very well, surprisingly. But actually, it's real. Uber is actually now thinking about how do you put VTOLs, vertical takeoff and landing electric jets, on top of its platform, such that you can order a plane, and in this case, taking 15 minutes from San Francisco to San Jose in what would previously taken way over an hour. And we've invested actually at Atomico in a company that's doing just this. It's called Lilium. It's based here out of Germany in Munich, and this is the world's first electric vertical takeoff and landing plane.
The last 2 points that we'll make are, one, in marketplace businesses, we've got so many inputs, it's extremely important to have health or Northstar metrics. And at Uber, these are some examples of supply and demand Northstar metrics that we use, that we managed against every day, that our cross-functional teams were aligned on and focused on, and were the arbiters of disagreement. So if you had a disagreement between your product team and your design team, or your operations team and your policy team, these were some ways that we used to arbitrate those discussions. For supply, it was average net revenue per hour that was 20% greater than alternatives. For demand, it was pretty simple. It was what percent of time does the car show up in 5 minutes. And those may sound narrow, but actually what we found was that they were actually really good summations of the inputs that went into creating the business that we did.
And so when you put that all together, this is kind of, all of that stuff we've talked about, this is how it works. This is how it started in San Francisco. You can see there's 10 cars and one guy ordering it. Team got very excited when this happened. Then as you scale, this is a picture of London, as you start to get more and more cars. By the way, this is sort of a piece of software that we had that we could look at every city to see what was happening. And you can see the number of cars starting to scale in London. That's just building up. And then when you really nail it, this is the tipping point. This is a picture of Manhattan. And you can see every single dot on there, including the yellow taxis, is an Uber-enabled car. So essentially you can't move, and the average wait time is like a minute. So final slide. Lessons learned.
One of the questions we get asked a lot is, what did you learn, right? Some things went right, some things went wrong. What did you learn? And so we put this together, and we'll walk you through it quickly. The first thing is mission matters a lot in a company. In an early stage company, motivating your team and achieving ambitious ideas and results can be extremely driven by having an ambitious mission. That tied a lot to Uber's philosophy. Uber had a distributed team that had people that were in almost every city in the world that we operated in, I think now in over 90 countries around the world. Those teams were extremely empowered. Our general managers were often told, you're the CEO of your city. And as somebody who went through that experience, that empowerment and trust led to a deep degree of ownership over the performance and customer experience of the business. None of it really matters if you don't have tech that scales, right? If your product experience doesn't scale and your tech isn't capable of scaling, it's much more difficult, much more costly, much more challenging to actually get there. And once you've got those things, it's important to go fast. At Uber, one of the most valuable pieces of information we had was our expansion playbook. It was effectively a highly replicable Asana checklist that somebody could open on Monday and have a city launched on Thursday. And the speed at which we could do that, because of highly replicable processes, tools, and expertise, were really relevant.
To put that in context, I think at the height it was one city every 5 days. And the only way you do that is by having those things above. We just wanted to touch on regulatory approach because that went right to some extent. And I think it went right in the sense that if we'd waited in lots of places, we probably would still be in 3 cities in the US. So I think the ability to, let's put it in the positive spin, ask for forgiveness rather than permission, to some extent worked well. You'll see it appears on the second column in a minute.
What didn't work, right? And where were some of the challenges? One was that at Uber, we had these distributed teams, and they're extremely empowered, and they had the ability to really control their own destiny. But in that situation, and it's an extremely important part of, I think, the foundation of any business, is really being clear about what your values are, what you stand for, and what you're prepared to accept and go forward with. The second, particularly from a leadership perspective, is this idea of being open to feedback, speaking truth to power, and being willing to hear ideas that disagree with some of the fundamental tenets of what you've thought in the past. And I think there's a challenge, for entrepreneurs in the early stage of a company where you get so much self-doubt. But as you start to see success, it validates a lot of the points that you've challenged and gone through. And so being open-minded as you get to a later stage is particularly important. Diversity is a really important part of building any company. And I think at Uber, we actually had more diverse teams than we got credit for. But diversity can actually lead to much better outcomes. Diversity of people, diversity of thought, diversity of geography matters a lot. And I think it's something that we think could have done a lot better early on.
And then finally, I said I'd return to this. I mean, the regulatory approach did not work on the other side in lots of places, like including here in Berlin. I remember sitting in front of the mayor here and him saying, hey, you're the first guy from Uber who's ever talked to me. What gives? And you guys just don't, regard the law. And I think the lesson learned there, and we argued about it a lot internally, was one size does not always fit all. Although on the left-hand side, the playbook was super important to have that uniformity in our tech and our know-how. When it comes to regulatory approach, it definitely does not. I had the same experience dealing with Japan as well. So I think lesson learned there that did not work well was that one-size-fits-all regulatory approach. Okay, that's it. Sorry, we ran a few minutes over. I don't know if...
We have time for...
Yeah? Okay. Cool. All right. Apparently we have time for a couple of questions. Yeah?
Cool.
All right. Anybody got a question? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. I found it really interesting. Although I'm not a very big fan of Uber, it was interesting seeing some key points of your business development. 2 key messages I got from your presentations were that referral marketing is key and the geographic limitization. Could you state to what extent these experiences are transferable to B2B business ideas? Because Uber and the other companies I saw on your sheets were rather B2C business models.
Yeah. I think B2B is quite different. And by the way, I don't think this applies to all B2C players either. These are specific Uber lessons. I've seen referral schemes work well in other businesses, but not quite to the same extent. So typically, I've seen them work to sort of 25-30% of the demand-side acquisition on referral schemes. I think it can work, though. I've seen it on B2B businesses where referral on the supply side can work, but you've got typically a much longer and more complicated sales cycle on B2B marketplaces, and referrals are probably going to be less effective. Having said that, I have seen schemes where they do work.
In my experience, where referrals have worked well on the B2B side is actually in the US, where I think there's more willingness to adopt earlier stage unproven B2B products than maybe there is in Europe. So with Uber Eats, for example, we had very different experience sort of selling to restaurants in the US than we did in Europe, where the referral scheme was actually reasonably effective.
And on the geographic thing, I would think really hard about the experience. If the geographic concentration creates a great experience, then do it. If that's less important, then it's probably less relevant for your business.
The other way you can apply that is also in terms of actual resourcing, right? So customer service resourcing, for example, is another way to think about that. If actually throwing a bunch of customers into your funnel actually dilutes the experience for everybody, it's the same principle.
But what I would say is, and I've seen this in a few businesses where they haven't got the experience right and they expand geographically too quickly, you're basically replicating a suboptimal experience. You've got to avoid that because you're just creating a massive headache. I saw one business that took its core concept, expanded it in 50 cities, and they had a shit experience in 50 places. That doesn't work. So get it right first before you expand. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for sharing, and congratulations on what you've done with Uber. So Uber's been done, other things have been done. I was wondering which areas do you think are more interesting today? What spaces are you looking at?
I think there's so many. Actually, one we highlighted in there was the let's call it the blue-collar workforce, where we've got this business called Job and Talent. They're selling workforce as a service. You've got this whole gig economy going on. But if you go to a traditional staffing agency, they take a long time. It takes, maybe 4 or 6 weeks to place someone, and it's 15 to 20% of their salary. These guys are interviewing, placing, signing contracts, scheduling people using tech and not people. So it happens in a matter of days, and they charge half the price. Right, and so they've got a marketplace that's matching the supply and demand, better product because it's tech enabled, not people, and half the price, so cheaper, better and cheaper. So that's an example of workforce, the labour market, that I think is ripe, and this business is doing extremely well. So that would be one.
I think that the next phase will be a really interesting one around marketplaces that are more managed and controlled. I think particularly for all kinds of labor and professional services. Right, so if you think about fields like law and health and engineering and design, right now the model is still very much based on either full-time employment or expensive contracting. And so the idea of applying the same principles that we've talked about around transparent pricing, cross-border transactions, and supply and demand matching could be really, really interesting and relevant around those areas. I think regulation plays a big part in that, right? Because there's licensing and requirements to actually be licensed. But I think we started to see a really interesting wave of companies that are going upstream on sort of supply labor marketplaces beyond blue collar.
I have to cut it off here because we have to switch. So thank you very much. Give it up for
Thanks.
Niall and Jambu. Thank you, guys.